Guys. This is the lab test review for the muscular system, and again we start with the cautionary message. Do not use this as a substitute for going to biosis or attending lab, simply as a supplement to your study materials in order to help you do better on the upcoming practical. So we're going to start out with muscle histology, and what we've got here are a couple of pictures of a particular muscle type. Now I'll give you let's say a minute to figure out what kind of muscle you're looking at in both of these panels. Okay, hopefully you came to the conclusion that this was skeletal muscle. Now, how can you tell that this is skeletal muscle? Well, number one, it's striated. If you look very closely at this picture, and again, the slides that are available in the lab will give you a better idea of what this stuff looks like under high power. But what you'll see are vertical lines, and those are called striations. You can kind of see them here, and you can see them a little bit here. And the striations are the result of the regular arrangement of the two of the major muscle proteins, actin and myosin. This is skeletal muscle, so it is both voluntary and striated, and it is also multinucleate, meaning it has more than one nucleus per cell. Essentially, skeletal muscle tissue is designed to be a protein factory, and if you look at the structure of a skeletal muscle cell, what you see are stacks and stacks of cylindrical arrangements of these actin and myosin filaments interdigitating with each other. And the cell itself is a very long structure that has a lot of nuclei and a lot of mitochondria. The nuclei are present because the cell needs to engage in a lot of biosynthesis, and the mitochondria are there to provide for the high energy needs of skeletal muscle tissue. So the first question under consideration here is, what is the structure indicated by the arrow? And that is a nucleus. Okay, the dark stain indicating that there's DNA present in this region. And you'll notice that you've got quite a few nuclei arranged throughout this long cylindrical cell, generally at the periphery. Is this tissue considered multinucleate? And the answer would be yes. The way that skeletal muscle tissue forms is that the cells that are eventually going to become skeletal muscle gather into a group during development and then lose their intervening cell membranes and become one giant multinucleate cell. Is this voluntary muscle tissue? And the answer is absolutely. We tell this muscle tissue what to do and when to do it. And is it considered striated? And the answer again is yes. Now we move on to a different type of muscle tissue. And I'll give you 30 seconds this time to figure out what kind of muscle tissue this is. Okay, and hopefully you came up with the answer that this is cardiac muscle tissue. And how can you tell? What are some of the hallmarks of cardiac muscle tissue? Well, number one, it is striated. If you look very closely, you can see these regular vertical light and dark bands running all along the length of the muscle. Number two, it's highly branched. That's one of the things that distinguishes it from skeletal muscle. Number three, it has only one nucleus per cell. Okay. And number four, and probably most importantly, it contains these regular dark lines, vertical lines. You can see them here, and those are called the intercalated discs. Now, the intercalated discs are important because they provide two very important functions to cardiac muscle. Number one, they seal the cardiac muscle cells to each other so that they don't come apart when the cardiac muscle squeezes, when it generates the heartbeat, which is, again, the only place where you find cardiac muscle tissue. And it also contains openings in this structure that are called gap junctions that allow the easy movement of ions from one cell to the other. And this is to ease electrical communication between heart muscle cells so that the heart can beat as a single organ. If you were to take a single heart muscle cell and isolate it and look at it under a microscope and give it nutrients and oxygen, what you would see is that it has a property known as autorhythmicity, meaning that it can beat on its own. However, if we were to take more than one muscle cell and look at them at the same time, what we would find is that they wouldn't necessarily beat in synchrony. Some might beat quickly, some might beat slowly. In order to avoid the problem of every heart muscle cell beating to its own rhythm, one of the precautions that the heart takes is to have these gap junctions present for the ease of the movement of the electrical signal across the heart wall. Later on, when we talk about the cardiovascular system in a little bit more detail, what we're going to discover is that the heart also has a built-in pacemaker called the sinoatrial node that sits at the base of the superior vena cava and acts as sort of the master rhythm setter for the heart. It periodically depolarizes and sends an electrical signal out that radiates across the walls of the ventricle. This electrical signal is then captured by the atrioventricular node that sits at the top of the interventricular septum, where it pauses for a moment to allow the ventricles to fill with blood as they basically receive it from the atria. And then that signal will rocket down the interventricular septum to the apex of the heart and then up the walls of the ventricle, after which the ventricles will squeeze and eject blood in the case of the right ventricle to the lungs, and in the case of the left ventricle to the entire body. So this is how we coordinate the electrical activity in the heart. The structure indicated by the arrow is an intercalated disc. This muscle is indeed striated, but it is not multinucleate. If you look very carefully, the intercalated discs demarcate the cell boundaries. And you'll see, if you look very closely, that you have only one nucleus per cell, even if that cell is highly branched. Is this voluntary muscle tissue? And the answer is no. This muscle tissue is under the control of the autonomic nervous system and, of course, the conducting tissue that's embedded in the walls of the heart. And then finally, the only type of muscle tissue left over is the type you're looking at here. This is smooth muscle tissue. It is not striated, and it is not multinucleate, and it is also not voluntary. It's governed by the autonomic nervous system. And where do we find this type of muscle? Well, we find it in the linings of organs, in the linings of blood vessels. We find it attached to every hair in your body as the erector pili muscle. We find it surrounding the pupil in the eye as it controls the diameter of the iris. Now, this muscle is governed by the autonomic nervous system. It still has contractile protein, actin and myosin, but they're arranged very differently in smooth muscle than they are in skeletal and cardiac muscle. They're sort of almost arranged in a net-like pattern just underneath the cell membrane of every spindle-shaped smooth muscle cell. So if you look here, that's a smooth muscle cell nucleus, as is that, and that. And what happens when the muscle contracts is that these spindle-shaped cells will shorten, and as a result, if we're in the linings of a blood vessel, what will happen is that the diameter of the blood vessel will shrink. That's what we call vasoconstriction, as an example of smooth muscle activity. Or if it's in the walls of an organ, it might push the contents inside that organ to another destination, such as when the esophagus squeezes food down to the stomach, or when the stomach ejects food into the small intestine. Just a few examples. You can always recognize smooth muscle tissue because the cells tend to be tapered on the ends and a little bit thick in the middle. So always look for that when you check out tissue under a microscope. Okay, the next few slides are going to talk about the sliding filament theory, and what it asks you to do is review the interactive physiology CD-ROM that came with your packet. But another good source of information about the sliding filament theory of muscle is in the lecture notes and in the review material that's posted up on Angel. If you look both in the video content area and on the lecture notes available as a PDF, you'll see a lot of information regarding the sliding filament theory. Now, essentially, just sort of to boil it down, to give you an overview, the way it is that muscle shortens is that there are two main muscle proteins, actin and myosin. Myosin are these thick filaments, and they have some interesting features. They have these globular heads that look like kind of like the head of a golf club, and there are several of them. And you've got myosin, which are these thin filaments, these twisted helical thin filaments, which contain binding sites for the myosin on their surface. And essentially, the way muscle contraction works is that a nerve impulse will come from the motor neuron, and the path that it'll take is from the dendrite to the cell body to the axon hillock to the axon itself, and then all the way down to the end of the axon, where it will end in what's called a synaptic bouton. That's French for button. Okay. When the electrical signal reaches this point, what will happen is that calcium will move in to the axon terminal, and neurotransmitters, specifically acetylcholine, will be released by these little vesicles that are waiting inside the synaptic bouton for this electrical signal to happen. These neurotransmitters will be released into this gap here called the synaptic cleft, and this area directly under it is called the motor end plate. And what will happen is that the acetylcholine will bind to acetylcholine receptors on the motor end plate, and that will trigger an influx of sodium into the muscle cell, and that constitutes a depolarization of the cell membrane. As this voltage spreads across the muscle cell membrane, the sarcolemma, it'll reach these pits in the muscle cell membrane, which are called T-tubules, and the electrical signal will then be propagated deep down inside the muscle cell, where it'll come into intimate contact with the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of the muscle cell, which is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And what's unique about the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the skeletal or cardiac muscle is that it's filled with calcium. So when this electrical signal jumps the gap from the T-tubule to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, calcium will be released inside the cell. Basically, it'll flood the zone. When it does, it will bind to a molecule that's attached to actin called troponin C. And when that occurs, the actin filaments will swivel and reveal their myosin binding sites to the globular myosin heads. And at that point, actin-myosin cross-bridging can occur. And you can see the sequence of actin-myosin cross-bridging here. We can start with a head that binds to ATP, okay? What happens then is that the head will cock back in what's called the activated position, okay? And then it'll search out a myosin binding site on the actin filament with the ATP now hydrolyzed but still bound to the head. It'll then attach to the actin filament and grab and pull. And that's the power stroke, okay? So basically it reaches out, grabs, and pulls, and what happens as a result is this entire contractile unit, called the sarcomere, will shorten. The distance between here and here will shrink as the actin basically crawls across the top of the myosin. Once the ATP has been released after the power stroke has ended, the head can then disengage once it binds ATP search out the next myosin binding site on the actin, and continue the power stroke. And how long does this go on? It goes on as long as there's calcium around inside the cell and as long as there's ATP to sustain contraction. Soon as the nerve signal to the muscle ends, the calcium gets pumped back inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then the actin will pivot and hide its myosin binding sites from the globular myosin heads, and at that point these filaments will slide back to their original length, so the muscle will relax. And then if there's another signal from a motor neuron, the whole cycle can begin all over again. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell, basically. And so you can see some of the major components. You're looking here at the sarcomere. The Z lines would be at the edges here. This is the zone of overlap, okay, which changes depending on the state of contraction of the muscle. This is the H or hypochromatic zone. And you can see here the motor end plate, the synaptic bouton, the T-tubules, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This structure here with these sort of enlarged sacs in contact with the T-tubule, this is called a triad because there's three structures nested right together, and it's their close contact that allows the electrical signal to jump from the membrane to this internal organelle that ultimately results in the release of the calcium inside the cell. So looking here at some of the components of the contractile apparatus, let's just be clear what we're looking at. All right, this is myosin. Okay, this is the myosin head. This is the part that binds the ATP and also binds to the actin. Okay, the tip binds to the actin. There's another site on the myosin head that binds the ATP. This is the actin, these little purple balls here, and you can see that they're arranged in a helical, double helical arrangement. And then this strand here is called tropomyosin, and it's what hides the myosin binding sites from the myosin heads. And then these sort of light colored yellow balls here, that's the tropomyosin, okay? And it's the tropomyosin that binds to the calcium that causes the actin filament to pivot so that the myosin binding site is revealed. So if we go through each of these questions, we can answer them now effectively. Which of these proteins has a binding site for ATP? That's number 4, the myosin. Which of these proteins has a binding site for myosin? And the answer is number 3, the actin. Which of these proteins has a binding site for actin? And the answer really here is twofold. Definitely number 4, right? Because myosin and actin interact, okay? But also the tropomyosin has a binding site for actin, okay? Because they're intimately associated in the thin filament, okay? So the tropomyosin here would be number 1. And which of these proteins has a binding site for calcium? And the answer here is number 2, and that is troponin. Okay, this is just showing you the cross-bridging cycle, which is a repeating sequence of actin-myosin cross-bridge formation, the power stroke taking place, the release of the hydrolyzed ATP, the binding of a fresh ATP, the release of the myosin from the actin, the reactivation of the head, and then the seeking out of the next actin myosin binding site so that the new cross bridge can form and a new power stroke can take place. And so this repeats and repeats and repeats until the nerve signal stops. So the first question, does cross bridge formation occur before or after the hydrolysis of ATP? And the answer is after, okay? After the hydrolysis of ATP. So as you can see here, the ATP binds. It is then hydrolyzed while it's still bound to the myosin head, and then the cross-bridge formation takes place. Next question, is ATP or ADP bound to myosin when myosin is in the high energy configuration? And the answer is ADP, okay? Once we activate now the head, the energy is transferred from the ATP to the head, and now the head can seek out the myosin binding site. The binding of what molecule to myosin initiates cross-bridge detachment? And the answer is ATP. Without ATP, we can't let go of the actin, and we can't repeat the cycle. Okay, so that's why both calcium and ATP are required in order for cross-bridging to take place. Okay, some more questions. Which step shown above represents the power stroke? And the answer is step number 2. Okay, you can see it here. Is calcium bound to troponin in step 1? And the answer is yes. Has to be, otherwise actin-myosin cross-bridging could not form. Last question. Which myofilaments are moving in the above diagram, the thick or the thin filaments? And it's the thin filaments that are moving across the surface of the thick filaments. Okay, that's what results in the shortening. Okay, this next block is going to be muscle ID, and the muscles we're concerned with here are the skeletal muscles, which are the voluntary muscles. So for the arrows on each of the following slides, we want to identify the indicated muscle and give a function. Okay, so we will begin that here in just a second. Okay, so we're going to give some muscle ID, and then we're going to do some muscle actions. So first thing we're looking at is a side view, lateral view of the cervical and the cranial region. And we want to know what is the name of this muscle. This is the corrugator supercilii, muscle that helps you frown. Next, what is this muscle down here? Okay, this muscle down here is the buccinator, and it's the muscle that helps you suck and blow. Next muscle, what is this muscle here? This is the orbicularis oris. This helps you open and close the oral cavity, the mouth. And down here, what's this muscle? This is the depressor labii inferioris. Helps lower the lip. Lower the lip. Okay, what's this muscle here? This is the depressor anguli oris. Helps pull down the corners of your mouth when you frown. This muscle back here is the trapezius. It's a prime arm mover, and we'll talk a little bit more about its actions in a bit. This muscle here that starts up behind the ear and attaches to the clavicle, the mastoid process, and the sternum is the sternocleidomastoid, and this helps with moving the head, moving the head. And finally, this muscle here is the temporalis muscle. Okay. Another view. Okay. One of the things that you have to understand about the models that are in the lab is that one side of the model tends to be the superficial view, one side of the model tends to be the deep view. So if you look at the previous view here, all right, notice that you can see the zygomatic bone, the orbit. Okay, so this is the deep view, and this side over here is the superficial view. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these models. Okay, we want to know what is this muscle here. This is the sternocleidomastoid, okay, visible on both sides. Again, you can see it over here, okay, because again it attaches right behind the ear, right to the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Okay, what's this muscle back here? That's the trapezius, big diamond-shaped muscle in the back. Again, it's a main mover of the arm. This is the scalenus medius. Okay, the scalenes elevate and depress the ribs. Okay, so this is one of the muscles that's used in breathing. Okay, this muscle down here, the depressor anguli oris, and it basically pulls down the corners of the mouth. This is the zygomaticus. Now there are two zig muscles, the zygomaticus major and the zygomaticus minor. Not every individual has both. Okay, the major is longer than the minor. Okay, and the minor tends to be superior to the major in individuals that have both the major and the minor. It's called the zygomaticus because it attaches to the zygomatic bone, which is your cheekbone. This is the levator labii superioris. Now, if you just didn't know anything about that muscle except for its name, what would you think that it does? And the answer is it elevates the upper lip. Okay? Right there in the name for you. And this, of course, is the orbicularis oculi, and it helps open and close the eyelids. Okay, moving on. This muscle here is the orbicularis oris, helps open and close the mouth. This is the depressor anguli oris, pulls down the corners of the mouth. This is the depressor labii inferioris, pulls down the lower lip. The levator labii superioris lifts the upper lip. And this is the orbicularis oculi. Orbicularis oculi. Okay, backside. This is the occipitalis. And then down here is the trapezius. This is a view of the back. This is the superficial side. This is the deep side. This is the erector spinae. This is one of the muscles that helps you stand up straight. You can tell its action from its name. It erects the spine. Down here is the latissimus dorsi. This is, again, a big muscle, superficial muscle in the back that's involved in the movement of the arm. This is the trapezius, also involved in the movement of the arm and the scapula. Up here is the deltoid. Its major movement is arm abduction. And then, of course, up top is the trapezius. Okay, this is a view of the abdominal and the thoracic region and a little bit of the cervical region. This is the deltoid. This is the pectoralis major. Again, it is another major mover of the arm. This is the biceps brachii. It's involved in elbow flexion. Down here is the external oblique. This is one of 4 muscles that are involved in holding your abdominal pelvic contents inside your abdominal pelvic cavity. The muscle that's deep to the external oblique is over here, and it's the internal oblique. And the muscle that has its fibers that run along the long axis of the body is the rectus abdominis. Okay, so what do these muscles do? Well, the rectus abdominis, that's your sit-up muscle. Okay, it helps you bend at the hip. The external oblique allows you to swivel. It also is involved in something called the Valsalva maneuver, which we use in childbirth, defecation, and emesis. Up here is the pectoralis minor, lies just underneath the pectoralis major, and is again a muscle that's involved in moving the arm. And then finally we have the sternocleidomastoid, which is involved in flexing the neck. This is lateral view. Okay, lateral view, and this is the deep side of the model. Okay, so down here you're looking at the internal intercostals, muscles that help you breathe. These are the external intercostals, also muscles that help you breathe. They elevate and depress the rib cage. This is the serratus anterior, sometimes known as the boxer's muscle, and it's involved in throwing and punching. So it's a major mover of the arm, and this is the pectoralis minor, which lies just underneath the pectoralis major and is also very important in arm movement. This is again the deep side of the torso. You can see here the pectoralis minor, the rectus abdominis, the external intercostals, and the serratus anterior. Okay, deep view, deep view. Okay, now we're looking at muscles in the abdominal pelvic region. We've removed the chest wall and the abdominal pelvic muscles that basically hold the organs in. We've also removed the stomach and the small and large intestine. And what you're seeing back here is the posterior body wall. Okay, so first name we want to know what is the muscle here. Okay, this is the iliacus. Okay. Now, why is it called the iliacus? Because it's attached to the ilium. There's the crest of the ilium right there. Remember that that's one of the 3 parts of the hip, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The pubis, of course, in the front, the ilium, the crest of the hip here, and the ischium, the part of the hip upon which you sit. This is the sartorius. It is an S-shaped muscle, sometimes called the Taylor's muscle, that runs from lateral to medial across the front of the thigh and inserts just below the kneecap. These are your adductors, and what they do is they bring the leg back to midline. It's a group of muscles. The abductor longus, the abductor magnus, and the abductor brevis, along with the pectineus, are all part of this group, and they are all designed to bring the leg back towards midline. And this, of course, is the diaphragm, the muscle of breathing. When the diaphragm contracts, it goes from this domed shape to a flat shape. Because the thoracic cavity is a closed chamber that contains air, what happens is that it creates a vacuum around the outside of the lungs. You can see a little bit of a lung here, and that causes the lungs to expand because they cling to the thoracic wall. And as long as your nose or your mouth are open, air will rush in. This is the posterior aspect of the chest plate of the model. So what we're doing here is we're looking from back to front, and this muscle here is a transverse abdominis. And again, it's involved in the Valsabian maneuver. It's also involved in hip flexion. Okay, and notice that the fibers of the muscle run perpendicular to the long axis of the body. This is the long axis of the body. This is perpendicular to it. So this is one of the deeper muscles. It predominates at midline. Okay, the obliques tend to dominate on the lateral edges. A way to remember the direction of fibers in the internal and external obliques. The external obliques have their fibers run the same way that your hand runs when you put it in your pocket. Okay, and the internal obliques run at a right angle to that. Okay, here we're looking at the lower part of the cephalic region and the cervical region. This is the orbicularis oris, the muscle that's involved in opening and closing the mouth. There's the sternocleidomastoid. The digastric muscle is involved in moving the tongue, okay, and it connects to the hyoid bone and to the tongue. The hyoid bone is unique. It's a bone that's inferior to the mandible and does not articulate with any other bone in the body. This is the depressor labii inferioris, and as you probably guessed, it lowers the lower lip. Here we're looking at a lateral view. This is the deep side of the back. This is the superficial side. This is the deep side. So the muscles we're looking at here are the serratus anterior, the latissimus dorsi over here on the superficial side, the erector spinae on the deep side, and the trapezius. Okay, so that you know what's what. Here we're looking at the lumbar and gluteal region, and here you can see the gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus, and the latissimus dorsi. What do the medius and the maximus do? They help with basically extending the leg. Okay, extending the leg. Remember, in anatomical position, when you walk, you use your glutes as a way to propel you forward. Okay, if you want to use your glutes right now, stand up and take your right leg and stick it behind you. Okay, extend it behind you, and you'll feel the glutes working. Okay, so it's involved in extension of the leg. Okay, here we got a lateral view of the thoracic region, and we're getting a lateral view of the brachial region as well. This is the triceps brachii, involved in elbow extension. This is the biceps brachii, and it's involved in elbow flexion. Now, why do they have these names? The tricep has this name because it is a three-headed muscle. The biceps is a two-headed muscle, and they're both in the brachial region in the upper arm. Okay, if you know your map of the body, the names of the muscles start to make more sense. This is the pectoralis major, again, another mover of the upper arm. And then finally the deltoid, which is involved in arm abduction. Okay, more muscles. Okay, this is the brown torso, so a slightly different model here. Which one of these muscles can act on both the head and the scapula? So what are we looking at here? This is the frontalis. This is the sternocleidomastoid, and then up here you've got the trapezius. Okay, So the trapezius connect on both the head and the scapula. Why is that? Because it has attachments to both the head and the scapula. It's attached to the occipital bone, and it's also attached to the superior and medial borders of the scapula. The trapezius is a very large muscle, okay? Incidentally, if you're curious, this muscle here, which is on top of the sternocleidomastoid, this is called the platysma, Okay, which of these muscles would you use to blow air out of your mouth? And the answer here is muscle number 2, the buccinator, okay? What are these other muscles? Well, that is the zig major, okay? There is the buccinator, and then down here is the depressor anguli inferioris. Okay, moving on, lower view of the mandible. What is this muscle down here? That's the digastric muscle, helps to move the tongue. Also involved in swallowing. Over here, would muscle number 1 be used to open or close the mouth? What is muscle number 1? Now, muscle number 1 is the masseter. Okay, the masseter attaches to the mandible and to the zygomatic bone. It runs underneath the zig major and minor, and it's involved in chewing. Okay, so it's a major mouth closer. Okay, is the digastric muscle visible in these two views of the head? And the answer is it is not visible because it lies inferior to the chin. Okay. All right. Next view. Posterior view of the head. Compare the function of this muscle with the sternocleidomastoid. The occipitalis muscle is named for the bone it lies on top of, which is the occipital bone. And what it does is it moves the scalp. The sternocleidomastoid extends the neck. Okay, and you can tell because here you have an attachment to the mastoid process and an attachment to the clavicle and scapula. When this muscle pulls, it's going to pull the head back. Okay. Name another muscle that has at least one action in common with this muscle. Well, this is the temporalis muscle. And it acts along with the masseter and helps you to chew. Okay, there's the masseter, there's the temporalis. And again, the temporalis muscle is named for the bone it lies on top of, which is the temporal bone. Okay, 3 more muscles. What are they? Okay, number 1 is the trapezius. See this big diamond-shaped muscle here. Okay, major mover of the arm. Number 2 is the deltoid. There's one deltoid. There's the other deltoid. Number 3 is the triceps brachii, involved in elbow extension. The deltoid can both flex and extend the arm. Okay, it can both flex and extend the arm. It has a lateral, a medial, and an anterior head. Okay, and as a result, it can do all 3. Okay. Remember that the arm, when we say the arm, we mean the upper arm. The forearm or antebrachial region is a different region of the body. Okay. Name these 3 muscles in order from superficial to deepest. Okay. So, again, we have to look at the drawing and understand what we're seeing here. This is a superficial view. This is deeper still, okay? And what we can see here are the serratus anterior, okay, the most superficial of the muscles. Then the external obliques, okay, you can see those here, also here, okay, hands in pockets, notice the direction of the fibers. Then the internal obliques, whose fibers run at a right angle to the external oblique. And then finally the deepest muscle, which is the transverse abdominis, whose fibers run at a right angle to the long axis of the body. Okay? And just for your own edification, this muscle here is the rectus abdominis. Rectus meaning straight, meaning along the long axis of the body, so parallel to it. Okay, does muscle number 2 flex or extend the thigh? Okay, so what is muscle number 2? Muscle number 2 is the gluteus maximus, okay, and it extends the thigh, okay, it's a major muscle used in walking. It's one of the reasons that man is bipedal, Okay, one of several reasons. All right. Muscle number one is the latissimus dorsi, and it's involved in moving the arm. Moving the arm. Okay. Next view. This muscle here. All right. What muscle is this? Well, it's at the base of the lungs. This is the muscle of breathing known as the diaphragm. Does this muscle move up or down during inspiration? Okay, inspiration is the act of air moving into the lungs. So this muscle moves down during inspiration. That's when it is flexing. Okay, and it creates a negative pressure or vacuum that pulls air into the lungs by creating a vacuum around the outside of the lungs, which is translated to the lungs themselves. If the nose and mouth are open, the air will rush in. Okay. Here we have a superficial view on this side, a deep view on this side. All right. What muscle is number one? Muscle number one is the external obliques. Muscle number two is the rectus abdominis. Okay. What muscle is immediately deep to muscle number one? And the muscle deep to number one is the internal obliques, whose fibers are going to run perpendicular to these fibers, so they're going to run in this direction here. Okay. The rectus abdominis dominates at midline. The internal and external obliques dominate on the lateral aspect of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. Moving over here. Okay. Which of these two muscles was help in expiration? Well, what are we looking at here? Number one are the external obliques. Okay. The external obliques. And number two are the internal obliques. Okay, internal obliques, external obliques. So external because they're superficial, internal because they're deep. The internal obliques help with expiration by depressing the rib cage and causing the pressure in the thoracic cavity to go up. This increases the pressure on the outside of the lungs, and if your nose or your mouth are open, then the air will exit. Okay, another view, same torso. Which muscle shown can act to move both the scapula and the ribs? Well, muscle number one is the pec minor. Muscle number two is the pec major. Okay, the muscle that can move both the scapula and the ribs is the pectoralis minor. Okay, again, due to its points of attachment. The pectoralis major is primarily attached to the proximal head of the humerus and to the sternum. Okay, what muscle are we looking at here? We're looking at the internal obliques. The internal obliques. See the external oblique, the internal oblique, okay, and the transverse abdominis and the rectus abdominis. Again, the muscles of the abdominal pelvic cavity that hold the organs in place and help to compress the stomach contents and the abdominal pelvic contents. Okay, muscle indicated here is the transverse abdominis. Notice that on the model we can only see it by taking the chest and belly plate off and looking from behind towards the front. Okay, notice the fibers run at a right angle to the long axis of the body. Moving on, this muscle here, does this muscle act on the arm, the forearm, or both? This is the biceps brachii, okay, shown here, and it's involved in forearm flexion, okay. Next question, does this muscle act on the thigh, the leg, or both? Well, first of all, what is this muscle? This is the sartorius, and it flexes, abducts, and laterally rotates the thigh. It also helps flex the leg at the knee, okay. So, thigh or leg, it can do both. It can do both. Okay. What is the group name for these two muscles? Okay, well, first of all, what are these two muscles? Well, this is the iliacus, and then this muscle here is called the psoas major. So, psoas major, iliacus, okay? Iliacus so named because it attaches to the ilium of the hip. Psoas major is the muscle that sort of attaches to the lumbar spine and also down from the very last floating rib. Together, this group is known as the iliopsoas. Okay, so sometimes you'll see it referred to that in your textbook. Okay, here we're looking at a model of the arm. Okay, muscle number 1, the biceps brachii. Muscle number 2 is the triceps brachii. These two muscles are antagonists. What does that mean? It means that they oppose each other when they are flexed. Okay. The biceps brachii is involved in elbow flexion. The triceps brachii is involved in elbow extension. Okay, moving on. Muscle indicated here is the biceps brachii, again, involved in elbow flexion. Now there's a muscle right underneath it called the brachialis that does essentially the same thing. It is just underneath the biceps brachii, and it has very similar points of attachment, and it actually provides most of the force in elbow flexion. Okay, two more muscles. Muscle number 1 is the sartorius. Muscle number 2 is the rectus femoris, a member of the quadriceps femoris group. Okay, muscle number 2 belongs to the quads. What is the group name for these muscles? The formal name, the quadriceps femoris. Now, why is it named that? Quad, because there are 4 muscles that make up this group. The rectus femoris is shown here. Here is the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, and if we were to remove this muscle underneath it, would be the vastus intermedius. Those are the 4 muscles of the quadriceps. They all insert onto the patellar tendon, which attaches to the tibial tuberosity, and they are involved in extending the knee, okay? So basically straightening the leg, the muscles you use when you kick. Okay, next group. What are the muscles indicated here? Number 1, the vastus medialis. Number 2, the vastus intermedius, okay? Number 3, you can see it over here, the rectus femoris. And number 4, the vastus lateralis. Okay, how can you tell this is the vastus intermedius? The rectus femoris has been removed. Okay, so make sure that you understand the difference between superficial and deep. Okay, all right. Moving on. The muscle indicated here. Okay, this is along the inner aspect of the thigh. Okay. This long muscle down here is the gracilis. Okay. Okay. Moving on. What are these two muscles? Okay. These are the adductors. Okay. And muscle number 2 down here, the gracilis again. Okay. So again, the adductors are made up of the adductor brevis, the adductor longus, the adductor magnus, and the pectineus, the shortest of the muscles. Okay, thigh and leg, what are we looking at? Okay, muscle number 1, the gluteus medius. Muscle number 2, the gluteus maximus. Muscle number 3, the semitendinosus. Okay, now the semitendinosus is a member of a group of 3 muscles known as the hamstring group. Okay, and I'm sorry, my mistake. Muscle number 3 is the biceps femoris. I don't know why I made that mistake. The biceps femoris, the semitendinosus here, and the semimembranosus, which is directly underneath it. Okay, so the group of 3 muscles, and what do? They bend the knee. Okay, so again, biceps femoris, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius. Okay, moving on, lower leg. What are the muscles here? This is the soleus. Okay, and the muscle superficial to it is the gastrocnemius, and it attaches to the calcaneus by this here, which is the Achilles tendon. Okay, sometimes called the calcaneal tendon. Does this muscle act on both the leg and the foot? And the answer is yes. Okay, it's the muscle involved in pointing the toe. Okay. All right. Here we see the back of the thigh, and muscle number 1, indicated over here, is the muscle that's on the most lateral aspect. That's the biceps femoris. Okay. Muscle number 2, the semitendinosus. Muscle number 3, the semimembranosus. All members of the hamstring group. The hamstring group. Okay. How do I remember membranosus and tendinosus? The membranosus is the most medial muscle of the hamstring group. The tendinosus is in between, and the biceps femoris is the most lateral. The most lateral. Here we've got a view of the front of the leg. Okay, the leg as opposed to the thigh. Remember that the leg here is the area from the knee down. Okay, and the thigh is the area from the knee up. And what we want to ask is, what is this ligament? That is the patellar ligament. It inserts onto the tibial tuberosity, and this is very important tendon. This is what allows you to kick. Okay, this muscle here is the tibialis anterior. The reason it's called the tibialis anterior is because it lies on the front of the tibia, and it helps to lift the top of the foot. Lift the top of the foot. Okay. Some more questions. Name a muscle that abducts the thigh. Answer, gluteus maximus. Name a muscle that flexes the head onto the chest. The sternocleidomastoid. Name 2 muscles that elevate the mandible. The masseter and the temporalis. Name a muscle that can both flex the arm and the forearm. The biceps brachii. Name 2 muscles that can extend the head. The answer is the splenus capitis and the trapezius. Name a muscle that can both flex the leg and plantar flex the foot, the gastrocnemius. Name a muscle that can plantar flex the foot but does not flex the leg, the hamstring group. Name a group of 4 muscles that are antagonistic to the hamstrings, and that is the quadriceps group. My mistake. Name a muscle that can plantar flex the foot but not flex the leg, the soleus. The soleus. Okay. Okay. Name a muscle that can elevate and depress the scapula. That's the trapezius. Name 2 muscles that can adduct the thigh, the gracilis and the adductor group. You could pick any of the adductors, the pectineus, the abductor brevis, longus, or magnus. Name the 1 muscle of the quadriceps femoris group that can extend the leg and flex the leg, and that's the rectus femoris. Next question. Name the most lateral muscle of the hamstring group, and that is the biceps femoris. Okay, the biceps femoris. Question number 5. Name a muscle that can perform dorsiflexion. Okay, and the answer is the soleus. I'm sorry. The answer is the tibialis anterior. It's my mistake. And then number 7, name a muscle that is immediately deep to the gastrocnemius. That is the soleus. Next question, name a muscle that is needed to raise your arm above the horizontal position, the deltoid. And finally, name a muscle that is not part of the hamstring group that extends the thigh, and that's the gluteus maximus, the gluteus maximus. Okay? So if we review here, trapezius, the gracilis and any of the adductors, the rectus femoris, the biceps femoris, the muscle that can perform dorsiflexion, tibialis anterior, the soleus, the deltoid, and the gluteus maximus. Okay, name a muscle of the lower back that extends the arm, the latissimus dorsi. Name a muscle of the upper chest that flexes the arm, the pectoralis major. Name the only muscle found along the posterior aspect of the humerus, the triceps brachii. Name two muscles that form the iliopsoas group, the iliacus and the psoas major. Name four muscles that compress the abdomen, the internal and external obliques and the transverse abdominis. Would the adductor muscles of the thigh be located on the medial or lateral aspect of the thigh? The medial aspect. Name the muscle that runs from the xiphoid process of the sternum to the pubic symphysis, the rectus abdominis. And name the long strap-like muscle that runs obliquely across the anterior thigh, and that is the sartorius. Okay, moving on. Name a muscle that both extends the arm and the forearm, the triceps brachii. Name two muscles that medially rotate the arm, the delt and the pec major. Name a muscle that can flex and extend the arm, the delt. What muscle is located between the external abdominal oblique and the transverse abdominis, and that's the internal oblique. Name two muscles that can act to raise the ribs, the external intercostals and the diaphragm. Name two muscles that act on the scalp, the frontalis and the occipitalis. Name two muscles that are used to rotate your head, the sternocleidomastoid and the splenus capitis. Name two different muscles that flex the arm, the rhomboid major, the rhomboid minor, the trapezius, the pec minor, the serratus anterior, and the levator scapulae. Name two muscles that flex the arm, the deltoid and the biceps brachii. Okay. Name two different muscles that extend the arm, the triceps brachii and the delt. Is the gracilis located on the medial or lateral aspect of the thigh, the medial? Name the two muscles that can flex the vertebral column and flex the thigh, the iliacus and the psoas major. Name a muscle that draws the scapula forward and down, the corrugator supercilii. Name a muscle that acts on both the head and the scapula, the trapezius. Is the semimembranosus found deep or superficial to the semitendinosus? It is found deep. Name a muscle that draws the eyebrows together, wrinkling the forehead skin vertically, the corrugator supercilii. What group of muscles consists of three columns of muscles that are prime movers of back extension? The erector spinae. Name the circular-shaped muscles that close the lips, the orbicularis oris. The ones that close the eyes, the orbicularis oculi. A muscle that raises the lower lips, the levator labii superioris. And a muscle that lowers the lower lip, as in a pout, the depressor labii inferioris. Last slide. Complete each of the following sentences with the word extension or flexion. Movement number 1 indicates extension of the arm. Movement number 2, extension of the forearm. Movement number 3, extension of the thigh. Movement number 4 is flexion of the leg. Flexion of the leg. Okay, we're all done, and I'll see everybody in class. Thank you.